Chapter 49. The long column wound slowly across the desert, heading for the oasis where the Koresh Bedouin tribe were camped. The mounted Bedouin warriors herded a file of manacled Tuolagi prisoners before them, the bandits forced to walk while their captors rode. The Tuolagi, no longer the scourge of the desert, were a pitiful, footsore group, more like beggars than the feared raiders they had been. In a final symbol of their downfall, Selethan and 3 of his officers had walked among the bandits, tearing the blue veils from their faces and throwing them on the ground. Mindful of the way they had treated his bodyguard, the Wakir also removed their boots, letting them hobble on cut and bruised feet for the journey. Unlike Usal, however, he provided them with sufficient water. Before the party left Marshavar, Selethan called the people together in the market square. Standing above them, on the platform that had been intended for his execution, he harangued the crowd, reminding them of how they had cried for his blood only a few days earlier. The townspeople hung their heads and shuffled their feet guiltily. He assured them that he would be in contact with the Wakir of their province and that a heavy tax would be levied. The first part of this would be a requirement for Marshavar to refurbish its walls and watchtowers and organize an effective defense force, he told them. The Marshavites nodded gloomily. The walls were in a parlous state, and repairing them would mean months of hot, heavy work. But philosophically, they accepted his words. He was right, after all. They should be better prepared to defend themselves against future marauders. There was at least a little good news to brighten the townspeople's spirits. Selethan decided to leave 30 of the Tuolagi captives behind to do the heavy work. "They'll have a hard time of it," Erak said to the Wakir when he heard about that arrangement. Selethan turned pitiless eyes on him. "They slaughtered the men escorting you, remember?" he said coldly, and Erak nodded. He had no real sympathy to waste on the Tuolagi. The remaining prisoners would be taken from the Jaspar oasis to Mararok, where they would spend their lives at hard labour. Selethan had negotiated with Umar for an escort of Bedouin warriors to conduct them there. Umar agreed readily. He would be glad to see so many potential enemies taken away and kept in chains. Like Erak, he had no sympathy for them. The returning war party and its additional members received a noisy and enthusiastic greeting when they arrived at the oasis. The Bedouin women stood in 2 welcoming lines, shrilling a welcome in an eerie, ululating chant, as their menfolk rode slowly back into the massive grove of trees. The Tuolagi prisoners, following behind, were greeted with an ominous silence. They shuffled past the double line of silent women, their heads bent and their eyes down. They were still unaccustomed to showing the world their faces, and they were only too aware that their lives rested on a knife edge. Their former leader, Usal, travelled on a litter behind a camel. He was still concussed from the massive blow he had taken to the forehead when Evenlin's heavy marble missile had struck him. On the infrequent occasions when he regained consciousness, he raved and gibbered. Sometimes he was even seen with tears running down his cheeks. Evelyn regarded the result of her handiwork with some misgivings. "Do you think he'll recover his senses?" she asked the healer, who had accompanied the Bedouin war party. The older man touched the massive blue and yellow bruise that disfigured the Tuolagi's forehead and shrugged. "Head wounds are uncertain," he told her. "Maybe tomorrow he'll improve. Maybe in a year. Maybe never." He smiled at her. "Don't be too concerned, young lady. He doesn't merit any pity." She nodded, but she wasn't completely comforted. She didn't like the fact that she had reduced a man, no matter how evil he might be, to a drooling idiot. Her spirits recovered on the second night back at the oasis, when the Koresh Bedouin organized a feast of welcome and celebration. They ate spiced roast lamb and peppers blackened in the fire until their tough outer skins could be peeled away, then stuffed with flavored rice and a cereal the Bedouin called couscous. Light and fluffy, spiced with saffron and cumin and cardamom, and garnished with plump sultanas and thin flakes of toasted almonds. There were other delicious dishes of mutton or chicken, cooked in strange, conical clay cookpots called tagines, and mixed with more spices, dates, apricots, and root vegetables. The cone-shaped lids of the tagines retained the flavored steam from the cooking liquids, rendering the meat so succulent and tender that it fell from the bone. The meal was eaten with the hands, and pieces of fresh, flat bread were torn up to make implements. It was a delicious, greasy-fingered evening of eating to excess, a piece of indulgence the group felt they owed themselves after the hardships of their desert campaign. Holt, Gillen, Evelyn, Horace, and the two Scandians were given a prominent position in the circle sitting around the massive fire. Selethan and Will, however, were in the principal places of honour, seated to the right of Umar and his wife Sialima, respectively. Evelyn smiled at Horace and jerked her thumb towards the young ranger, currently engaged in animated conversation with the Bedouin leader and his wife. The two older people roared with laughter at something he had said, and he ducked his head, grinning, pleased that he had amused them. "He falls on his feet wherever he goes, doesn't he?" she said, a trifle wistfully. Horace looked across the fire at his old friend and nodded. "People like him," he replied. Then he added, "There's a lot to like after all." "Yes," Evelyn said, her eyes fixed on Will. For a moment, studying her, Horace saw a brief shadow of sadness pass across her face. He jogged her with an elbow, a little more enthusiastically than good manners dictated. "Sling us a peach, will you?" he said. She raised an eyebrow at him and grinned. "You don't mean that literally, do you?" she said. He smiled, glad to see she had shaken off her melancholy, knowing that she wouldn't be able to resist the pun on his use of the word sling. He held up his hands before his face in mock horror. "Please, please, spare me that," he said, and they both laughed. The Bedouin, as a general rule, didn't use alcohol. But out of deference to the two Scandians, several flasks of arariki, a brandy made from fermented dates and peaches, were provided. Now Erak and Svengel, at their own insistence, decided they would perform a sea shanty for the enjoyment and education of the assembled group. They stood on rather unsteady legs and began to bellow out the ribald tale of a penguin who fell hopelessly in love with a humpback whale. Since the desert-dwelling audience had never seen either animal, and so had no idea of the discrepancy in their sizes, much of the humour fell flat. So did much of the melody, but they applauded the enthusiasm of the singers and the sheer volume at which they performed, and the two sea-wolves resumed their seats, confident they had upheld the honour of Scandia. Holt was quiet, Gillen thought, but then Holt usually was quiet at events like this. Holt's eyes were intent on the animated young face of his apprentice as he talked and laughed with the Bedouin Asik and his wife. "He did well," Gillen said, and Holt turned to him, a rare smile touching the bearded face. "He did," he agreed. "Told you he would," Gillen said, grinning. Holt nodded acknowledgement. "Yes, you did. You were right." Gillen shifted to face Holt more directly, remembering something Holt had said some days previously. But you knew, didn't you? You said to us when we were in Marshavar that Usal had forgotten that Will was out there. So you knew he'd survived. How was that? Holt's face grew serious as he considered the question. I think knew is too definite a term. I sensed it. I've always had a sense about Will. There's a feeling of destiny to that boy. I've felt it since the first day he joined me. And now it's nearly time to turn him loose, Gillen said gently. He saw a mixture of sadness and pride competing in Holt's eyes. Then the grizzled ranger sighed. Yes, it is, he said. After the feast broke up, Evelyn's party sat with Umar and Selethan around a smaller fire. Selethan passed around coffee. Perhaps it's time we talked a little business, Selethan began, his eyes on Evelyn. There is the small matter of Erak's ransom. He paused expectantly, waiting for Evelyn to produce the money draft and her seal ring. Both items had been recovered from Usal. Evelyn, however, showed no sign of doing so. His ransom? She asked, and he nodded impatiently. Yes, you agreed to ransom him. I'm sure you can recall that, he added sardonically. Evelyn nodded several times, went to speak, then stopped, her hand raised in midair. Then, as if uncertain, she said to the Wakir, Just explain the concept of ransom to me, if you would. Selethan frowned. He had hoped to hurry through this matter and have it settled before anyone thought too deeply about it. It seemed he wasn't going to get away with it. I think we all know what a ransom is, he said evasively. Evelyn smiled at him. Humour me. I'm an addle-headed girl. Across the fire, Selethan hid a smile behind her hand. Umar, who had been told the background to this discussion by Will, leaned forward helpfully. If I might assist here, a ransom is paid by one party when a second party is holding a third party hostage. That's a lot of parties, Horace whispered to Will, and the young ranger grinned. So, Evelyn said, if I were the first party, I would pay an agreed amount to the second party who is holding the third party? Is that correct? Correct, Selethan said, thin-lipped. Evelyn frowned at him, a puzzled expression on her face. You can't really expect me to pay 66,000 reals of silver to Usal, can you? To Usal? The Wakir exclaimed, coming close to choking on his coffee. Why in the name of all that's bloody holy would you pay it to Usal? Evelyn spread her hands in an ingenious gesture. Well, he was the second party, wasn't he? He was the one holding Erak hostage when we found him, not you, she added, after a significant pause. That's a technicality, Selethan began in a blustering tone. But he had a sinking feeling. He was being outsmarted. He thought it might be a good tactic to change the subject, then work back to the ransom question later. Besides, Usal's future is yet to be decided, he said. That's a good point, Holt put in. What's going to become of Usal? Selethan gestured towards Umar. That's for the Bedouin to decide, I would say. What do you want to do with him, Asik Umar? Umar shrugged. I don't want him. You can have him if you want him. Selethan smiled for the first time since this discussion had begun. Oh yes, I want him. The man is a killer and a rebel, and we have a cell ready and waiting for him in Mara Rock. He's been a thorn in our side for longer than I can remember. With him out of the way, the Tuolagi will be a lot easier to handle. As a matter of fact, the Emrakir has been offering a substantial... He stopped himself a fraction of a second too late, realizing he had said too much. He feigned a fit of coughing to cover his lapse. Evelyn waited till he finished, then tugged at his sleeve, forcing him to make eye contact. "A substantial she said, mimicking his hesitation. "Would that be reward that you were going to say?" "Yes." The word was forced out from between Selethan's suddenly thin lips. "Now, let me get this straight," Evelyn said thoughtfully. "Who actually captured you, Sal? I mean, who actually defeated him?" She looked up at the stars, her brow knitted in thought. Then it cleared, and she said happily, "Oh, I remember. I did, with my little sling." "She's right," Umar said, grinning fiercely. "If anyone has the right to determine his fate, it's her." "So I'd be entitled to that substantial reward you mentioned?" Selethan was in an awkward position. If they had been conducting this discussion at Al-Shabar or in Mara Rock, he would have had the negotiating advantage that came with a large number of armed men to uphold his argument. But the only large force here was Bedouin, and their leader seemed to be in agreement with Evelyn. On top of that, the Wakir admitted, there was a certain validity to all her claims. He hadn't been holding Erak when the Scandian was rescued, and the Araluan princess was the one who had brought Usal down. Technically, the Tuolagi war leader was her prisoner. Technically, she owed Selethan nothing, and he owed her the reward. This wasn't how he'd planned things, he thought. "All right, let's get down to it," said Evelyn, dropping the little girl act and suddenly becoming all business. "Selethan, I believe we do owe you something, but not 66,000 reals. And we definitely owe Umar and the Bedouin something, because, without them, Erak would still be Usal's captive." "We didn't do it for the money, we did it for the friendship," Umar said, indicating Will when he mentioned friendship. Evelyn nodded acknowledgement. "You can always give it back if you like," she said. And, as Umar hastened to make a negative gesture, she smiled. "So, here's the offer. I'm willing to pay Umar and his people 20,000 reals for their help." She paused, taking in the looks of agreement and approval around the fire. It was a fair sum. She went on. "I'll pay the same amount to you, Selethan. 20,000. I think you're owed something." Before the Wakir could say anything, she added, "And I'll forgo the substantial reward for Usal. You can have him. Keep him. Cut off his ears. Drop him down a well if you like. I don't want him. Is that fair?" Selethan hesitated, then his own sense of justice cut in. The offer was effectively more than 40,000. She could offer nothing and get away with it. "It's fair. I accept gratefully," he said. Erak nodded his approval too. He thought Evelyn had handled the entire matter with great statesmanship. Stateswomanship, he corrected himself. "You're very generous, princess," he said, smiling indulgently at her. Evelyn looked at him, one eyebrow raised. "No, I'm not," she said. "You are. You're repaying the 40,000 to my father, remember?" "Oh, yes, of course," Erak said. He felt a stabbing sensation in his heart. Scandians often had that sensation when they lost money. Suddenly, he didn't feel like smiling anymore. The meeting broke up shortly after that, and Evelyn strolled back to her tent, her hand resting lightly on Holt's arm. When they were out of earshot of both Bedouin and Aridi ears, she turned to him, a little anxiously. "So, Holt, how did I do?" Like all of them, she thought, she wanted Holt's approval above all else. He turned that grim, bearded face on her and shook his head slowly. "Lord forgive me, I've created a monster," he said. Then he smiled and patted her hand gently. "And I'm very proud of you."